Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us here at TAP Centre for Creativity and online via Zoom for the London launch of David Huebert's new novel, Oil People. Since the launch of the Words Festival, and this will be the 11th year, I have been very fortunate to host David over the years to explore his first short story collection, Peninsula Sinking. I think that was 2017, would have been Peninsula Sinking coming out, as well as a virtual visit for his collection, Chemical Valley, while we were, I think, still within pandemical times, because we did that one on Zoom at the time. Though David hails from the East Coast, he spent many years with us here in London, completing his PhD at Western, as many of you will know in the room. And so I regard today's event as something like a homecoming, or a homecoming away from homecoming for you, to launch his debut novel. To begin, however, I'd like to extend a warm thanks to Sandra DeSalvo and the wonderful team here at TAP, especially Sarah and Kieran, for hosting today's event. It's such a beautiful space. It's actually the first time we've done an event for Words up in this space, and I love the exposed brick. It's a really cool room. I'd also like to thank Jenny Burkle of Little Wren Books, one of the many creative hats that you wear in our arts and culture community, who is on site to sell books today. So make sure you get a copy of David's book today. And for you online, you can get a copy of David's book from your local bookseller, wherever you get your books for where you're joining us. My name is Josh Lambier, and I'm the Artistic Director of Words, London's Literary and Creative Arts Festival. We're gathering today a few blocks away from the forks of Deshkanzibi, or Antler River, also known as the Thames, on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabeg, Haudenosaunee, Lenapuak, and Chinookan peoples. In the London area, we're governed by various treaties. There were the Treaty 6 London Township, the Treaty 7 Sombre Township, Treaty 21 Longwoods, as well as the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. This land continues to be home to diverse Indigenous people whom we recognize as contemporary stewards of the land and water, and as vital contributors to the artistic and cultural life of London and the region. And as we'll see today, David's novel is very much about the people, the animals, the water, and the land of southwestern Ontario. Part generational saga, part eco-gothic fable, Oil People is a southwestern Ontario story about history and family, land and power, and oil as an object of toxic wonder. It's also about the uncanniness of oil. The story takes us back to Canada's first oil boom in Lambton County in the 1860s, and its legacy for our petroleum age. A story that's almost forgotten, perhaps repressed, something we can talk about, in our cultural memory. Oil is a dark reflection, David writes, a visible remnant of the repressed. Just over 100 years ago, Sigmund Freud described uncanniness as an experience where something familiar, homely, or taken for granted suddenly becomes unfamiliar, eerie, or terrifying. The uncanny, Freud says, is, and this is Freud's words, that class of terrifying which leads back to something long known to us, once very familiar, and it works to blur the distinction between the imaginary and reality. Freud associated the feeling of uncanniness with visual stimuli that blurred the boundaries between life and death, the animate and the inanimate, with a keen focus on doubles, severed limbs, mirrors, ghosts, madness, and even the familiar setting of the home. The skeleton in the closet of the home, which is a great theme just in the aftermath of Halloween yesterday. I guess it's the Day of the Dead today too. So the ambiguity of these subjects pulls us in to discover something that has remained secret and hidden, but has now come to light. Jade Armbruster, a narrator for parts of Oil People, tells us this is a story of remnants and revenants, of things that bubble up. It's a story of the unhomely underworld of Sowesto home, to invoke that James Rainey phrase. So the unhomely within Sowesto home. David has won the CBC Short Story Prize, the Walrus Poetry Prize, and was a finalist for the 2020 Journey Prize. His first story collection, Peninsula Sinking, mentioned before, won the Dartmouth Book Award. His second short story collection, Chemical Valley, won the Alistair MacLeod Short Fiction Prize, as well as a finalist for the Thomas Rattle Atlantic Fiction Award and the Relit Award. He now teaches at the University of King's College in Halifax, Nova Scotia. The other King's College, which everybody confuses with ours, which, by the way, just a nice little historical fact, the mansion there, that's the seat of King's College, was actually owned originally by James G. Good, who is the co-founder of Supertest Petroleum Canada. So King's here is actually on the land of oil money. So
right, yeah.
Non sequitur, I guess, but a connection to the Kings. So please join me in welcoming David back to London and to Words to launch his debut novel, Oil People. So I thought we could begin by exploring your fascination with oil to set the table for our discussion. Because we're here in London with friends and collaborators, we can see people around the room who may know of your fascination, of your interest in oil, the aesthetics and poetics of petroleum, including your previous book, Chemical Valley. But for those who may be coming to your work for the first time, or a refresher, or for folks who are coming to us from out in internet land, I wonder if you could walk us through how you, to use your words, became obsessed with oil in 2016.
Yeah, thanks so much for that lovely introduction, Josh. It's great to be here. I can totally talk about oil and my fascination with it. Yeah, so I came here to London to start my PhD in 2013. I explored the area a little bit. I went in to talk with my supervisor, Josh Schuster, one day, my PhD supervisor, and I was like, yeah, I have this idea for a monograph about George Saunders that I want to write as my PhD project, a single author study. Very, very verboten. I could tell just by Josh's eyes. And then,
then I know that look.
Yeah, and then Josh is like, why don't you write about oil? And I was like, well, what's this guy talking about?
I didn't know this. I didn't know.
Yeah, it's not a story I often tell because, but I did. Yeah, but it is a true story.
Yeah.
Cool. But yeah, and then I was like, what's Josh Schuster talking about? And I ignored that for a while. And then I sort of, just in my travels around the region, just sort of getting to know the place, I went to Oil Springs, went to Petrolia. I explored that area. I actually knew, I got connected with some people that lived there through hockey.
Wow.
Is one of the ways that I got to know. There's like a whole small town. I was playing hockey just in the community here, and there's a whole small town. There's a robust sort of small town junior hockey system. And yeah, I got to know someone from Petrolia. He was interesting. And so I just asked him, Petrolia, what's that all about?
Yeah.
And he didn't really, have that much of a sense of the history.
Yeah.
And so then I made some very dear friends from Sarnia as well. And I visited Sarnia. All of you here know Sarnia, I'm sure, and what it's like, right? Even when I even when I talk in Halifax or Guelph, actually, or other places, usually there's someone that's like, I'm from Sarnia. I know exactly what you're talking about. And I always love to talk to those people and see what they think. And often what I have to say, it's usually, makes a certain kind of sense to them. But yeah, I was struck when visiting Sarnia by these massive refineries, right? Yeah. They really dominate the landscape.
Absolutely.
They're very hard not to see, and they're very much a visible presence, a visible indicator of sort of this thing that, as you were talking about, has been so largely repressed in our society, which is the actual material substance of oil, which I'd already been thinking about a little bit. I'd been doing a PhD in environmental literature, thinking about, I'd been going to like some petrocultures conferences and just thinking about this idea. Petroculture scholars like Imre Zaman talk about the invisibility of oil, right? And the stickiness of it, the lubricity of it. They have all kinds of, there's a lot of people out there theorizing oil in really robust ways right now. But yeah, you go to Sarnia and you see on the one hand, this really beautiful river, this really beautiful landscape, farm landscape, right? Everyone many people that are from there are also very attached to that landscape, right? For natural reasons. I mean, these are human beings. This is the home. And at the same time, you just can't not see the flares shooting off, right? And at the same time, another complicating layer of that is like the petroleum industry employs a lot of people and supports a lot of families, and people are just trying to get by. So for me, it immediately raised the question of sort of what it means to be alive in the oil age, and what sort of some of the complications and what are some of the different positionalities of just being today. John Valiant has called it the Petrocene, right? Yeah. And I'm very convinced that one of the primary ways this era will be remembered is as an oil-consuming era, right? And that oil also transforms us and shapes us, and that there's an intimacy in our relationship with oil that we don't often acknowledge, and that most of us don't spend a lot of time thinking about. I was just with a student yesterday, or like I was with a bunch of students in the classroom, but one student in particular couldn't get over this. She put her hand up and she was like,
I was there for this.
Yeah, Josh was there. Yeah, so it's going to be real funny. She was like, this is just a bit weird. Isn't it?
Elicited an audible laugh from David, which went right across the lecture hall.
And she couldn't get past this interest. She's like, I've never seen someone that was so passionate about something that's like, it's a bit gross.
Yeah.
Isn't it? Oil, it's like, it's a bit gross.
But your response was so gentle, and you were just like, it is weird, isn't it?
Yeah, I totally got where she's coming from, because there is that part of me and part of all of us. Obviously, I'm deeply fascinated by oil. I never would have written this book if I wasn't. But at the same time, I'm repulsed by oil, as all of us are. I mean, I think that's a very natural, it's hard not to be repulsed by oil, right? I'm not, unlike a character in this novel, I'm not personally bathing in oil for the medicinal properties, right? Spoiler alert. Maybe I'll read that section. Not right now. So I got to know people in Sarnia. I got to know the landscape, became interested in oil. And I started to ask people and ask myself and look into why there are all these refineries in Sarnia. And that was when I started to discover, there was this oil boom in the 1860s, late 1850s. It began, starting in the Lambton County in what was called Canada West, in Enniskillen. And that oil just burst out of the ground for basically 30 years and was gradually suckled out of the ground.
It'd be interesting to do what you did with Kate's class, actually, is ask them, how many people in here knew about the oil boom of the 1860s in Oil Springs or Petrolia? A few more than Kate's class, but still the majority not knowing about that. So, and maybe I can add a fold to this. So your fascination with oil really does find its center of gravity around the Lambton County oil boom in the 1850s, 60s, which has, as you note in your Hazlitt essay, which I think everybody should check out, become a buried footnote in Canadian history, even regional history, despite the museum and heritage sites that you can still visit today in Petrolia and Oil Springs. I don't want to put you on the spot to be the historian as such, but I think it would be really helpful, especially given the survey here, to set the scene by tracing how the first commercial oil well in North America was dug in Lambton County, and maybe give us a feel for the frenzy. Again, I don't want to give you the burden of giving the whole history, but give us a picture, paint a picture.
Well, that was James Miller Williams who became the North America's first oil man, or something like, maybe the world's first oil man. I forget what the quotation is. He was the first oil man. He was an oil father and an oil daddy. And that's one of the things that interests me as well throughout this, is the making of fathers, the making of forefathers, right? The construction of forefathers. That's something I think that's actively being done through oil. People raising a giant house on King's University College, right? Is one of the ways. I taught in the Imperial Oil Lecture Hall at Western University.
Arena was the co-owner of Supertest Petroleum.
A lot of people were there was always something deeply linked between settler colonial impulse and oil as well, right? So that's something I'm tracing and something I'm unpacking and training the gaze on as well. So it was James Miller Williams who brought that well, but it was just a hand dug well. There were these two guys called the Tuttle brothers as well in the 1850s who were searching around, and there was this land in Enniskillen, and one of the things was like it wasn't good for farming. So they were trying to figure out, they had access to it, they were trying to figure out what it was good for. And they were finding oil coming up by creek beds, and they were just, there's stories about sort of indigenous uses that I've never been able to actually verify. But apparently like early, like Simcoe, one of the Lieutenant Governor John Graves Simcoe was shown in the late 18th century some oil deposits along the side of the river by indigenous guides, right? So that's part of the story too. It's just in terms of that's probably how they found it. And then they were just sort of there was these people called the Tuttle brothers. They're just hand digging, creating wells of oil.
Yeah, really hand digging. And really hard to get here, but like no roads that would have been accessible to so you really had to really had to want to go
bushwhacking. Yeah. And then so the technology sort of developed, and they started to use more serious drilling or mining methods, but it was called a spring. So the first gusher that ever came up was in 1863. It was a guy named Hugh Nixon Shaw who brought in the first gusher. That was with a spring pole rig. They were using what was called a spring pole rig. So it's just, you would jump on this thing called a treadle.
I was Googling
there's a lot of jumping
videos so I can visualize.
There's a lot of jumping on treadles in my novel. Just people, so you just jump over and over again. And they have still, if you go to the Oil Museum of Canada, anybody been there? Oil Museum of Canada? Nobody's been there. Okay, well that's our moment, Josh. You should all go there. I think it's really, really an awesome and underrated museum. And you can see the spring pole rig. So you just jump on this treadle, and there's like a lever connected to a long limb that would then drive a bit into the earth, and sort of the long limb would go up and down, and the bit would be driven down into the earth. And that's how these people were mining. And so they would drill down, like Hugh Nixon Shaw, the guy who drilled, everyone thought he was delusional because he was drilling deeper than anyone else would drill. They all thought, oh no, the oil's around, the oil deposit is under there at a certain depth, right? Around 40, 50 feet. And he was like, I'm going to keep going. It's a rugged, just possibly he was delusional, who knows? And he kept going, and eventually he produced Leviathan, a liquid Leviathan from the earth. And then after that, technology continued to develop. So they would use a spring pole rig. Eventually, they linked all those sort of those drill bits together in what's called the jerker line system, which was driven by a steam engine. And so a bunch of them would be, and this is very prominent in the novel as well, a bunch of those would all be connected together by like sort of a wire or a cord, so that they could all drill down at once. And they're swaying back and forth. And if you go to the Oil Museum of Canada, you'll actually see this. And it's always sort of a little bit squeaky. So there's a real eerie sound to it. And there's something very uncanny and ghostly about that experience.
And still using it, like they're active wells.
Yes, there's still oil coming up on the from the Canadian Oil Museum,
which I did
Oil
not
Museum
know
of Canada,
until
and
I read
Fairbanks
this.
oil fields. And then technology continues to develop. They were also experimenting with refining at the time. So they were like boiling down oil in massive quantities, seeing what they could do with it, trying to get rid of the water. And they were, and eventually they started using nitroglycerin torpedoes, which they would shoot into the earth in order to like move rock around down there. So maybe the oil would be more accessible, which, side note, I also find really interesting because in the 1960s, the Premier of Alberta, whose name was Ernest Manning. Ever heard of Ernest Manning? Anyone ever heard of Ernest Manning? Well, get some nods. He also was famous for saying that oil was given by God, and therefore it was our duty to go, you know.
Those torpedoes sound like early fracking. Like
Yeah,
it's
well,
like,
he wanted to, Ernest Manning, that's where I'm going with this.
Yeah.
He wanted to shoot a nuclear bomb.
oh no, of course.
This is his idea. He's actually on record saying this.
Sounds like Trump
that he
with the
wanted to
nuclear
shoot
bomb
a
on
He wanted to
hurricanes.
explode a nuclear bomb in the Athabasca oil sands in
Wow.
Alberta to get access to that Earth money.
Well, and
God given.
it's such a great picture, and you can set the scene of where David's taking us in the novel into this just incredible, insane world of exploration. And they didn't, and you said this on your interview this afternoon, and it's something that didn't occur to me until you said it, that they didn't know what really oil was for at this point. So they're going after it like crazy, but you know, the idea of the combustion engine, that's not there yet. Like this is it medicinal? Is it for lubricants? Is it for oil lamps? Like they're still figuring that out. In his book, Hard Oilers, which you cite as a source text, and when I interviewed David on Zoom the last time, you had a copy in your hand and there were all these sticky notes in your copy, which is a very well thumbed copy of the book. It is a great book. Gary May remarks that Canada's seminal part in the opening up of our modern day oil industry has received very little attention from historians and writers, an omission that he regards with some astonishment considering the fact that the Lambton boom gave birth to one of the world's most important industries today. Like, not Texas, not Iran. This was in Lambton, County, Ontario that this happened.
Yep.
You've argued that the oil age demands confrontation, including our forgotten regional histories, which you have done by turning to fiction. Now that you've confronted the legacies of the region in your stories of Chemical Valley, and now you've confronted these histories in the novel form, working between these two genres, the short story and the novel, I wonder if you could talk about what the novel form offered you uniquely to jump into this story or this history that you were uncovering.
Yeah, it's a good question. Should I talk about the third part in the trilogy?
Sure. Yeah.
There's no trilogy. Pretty much done, I think.
I went right in for that.
The publisher really wants there to be a trilogy. No, it's a great question. The relationship between, I mean, for me, it's just the question of the relationship between the short story and the novel more generally, I guess, because I am exploring in my book of short stories, Chemical Valley, I'm exploring a lot of the same material as I explore in this, although totally different characters and sort of world of characters. I think that, so sustained immersion in history, sustained, just a sustained narrative, single narrative project is like the main thing that I get from this that I didn't get from writing a short story. I got to uncover a lot of the same, or a lot of similar sort of, I got to confront history in a similar way in the short story and the novel. Yeah, but the novel, I mean, it offers you a lot more. So the novel offers you, one big thing that the novel offers you that a short story doesn't is subplot. So I do use a lot of subplot in this. I use a lot of exposition. I use a lot of sort of textual archives within the form of the novel to, I think, make the novel sort of come alive and to give it a breadth and a depth that I don't really think is possible or achievable in a short story, unless a short story goes on for 300 pages. So I think that would be my best answer. I mean, I think a novel gives you many voices. I mean, this novel gives, not always, right? But this novel gives you many voices. And that was one of the things that was always really important to me, was to give voice to many different people living in many different moments of sort of the story of oil in this region, and also living with many different ideas about what oil could be and what oil should be. Should oil be something, are we obligated to use oil because, you know, in the interests of something like technoscientific innovation, right? There's people that would argue that, and there's people that are, you know, very, very pro scientific innovation, and this is part of that story. And how else would we have gotten here without that, right? And I do think the contemporary world is so beholden to oil that, that's like, could we have this hyper-technologized society, or could we even sustain this many people in this world right now without oil? I don't think we could, given our current what we have access to, right? Like you'd have to go pretty far back and start building again with some different tools.
Yeah, that's terrific. And I'll tell you why I won't make the mistake of asking about the third novel. When I was on the last interview that we did, I asked David, so when is the novel coming? And you said, well, Josh, writing novels is really hard.
I had learned that by then. I'd already learned that. Yes,
but it's here,
yes,
it's arrived.
yeah.
So when we talked about Chemical Valley in 2022, I asked you about the research process, and you outlined how you had talked to engineers, refinery workers, local residents, activists, as well as consulted the archives to build the world of the 1860s oil rush. And you had let the research seep in and stew, and then you tried, and I love this, you tried to then forget it all so that you could let it come back, almost like the capillary action of oil coming up from limestone as you wrote the story. So I do want to know whether that consume and then purge process was helpful for this particular process, but I want to add a different fold to this as well. The question, it was really struck when I read your Hazlitt essay that you made a remark about in the research process that you encountered reticence across the interviews, this idea of reticence or your encounter with reticence. Could you tell us how reticence, the reticence of these interviews or the conversations that you had with people helped you or operated in the writing process?
Totally, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I'm surprised I didn't mention this in the same conversation you were citing about Chemical Valley from Words. But yeah, this was definitely an experience that I had where I went and talked to oil workers, and they were very cagey and they were very reluctant, and they had actually, I had prearranged to go have a conversation with them. So they were aware that this was what they were doing. They weren't like, it was all above board. And then when I started asking them questions, they started to seem to second guess that whether they wanted to give me any information at all. And it was so immediately even in that exact moment, my thought was like, holy cannoli. I'm getting so much from this. Like they think they're withholding.
Oh, wow.
Do you know what I mean?
Because
I'm just someone I interview people half to get the information, maybe probably less than half, to get the information that they want to give me,
right?
And largely to just try to just ascertain some piece of human character from my interaction with them,
right? And find those silences.
Yeah, and it was clear to me that they were scared. It was very clear to me that they were scared, and they didn't. And I understand, and so that taught me a lot, right? That I understand totally. Like, these are people with decent jobs in Sarnia, and they want to keep those jobs. They might not have access to XYZ career, and they want to keep this job, and they don't always, and they might be a little conflicted about it, right? And they don't always. I think most people that are working in extraction and that are working, like most everyday workers in extraction and in just different sort of quasi-dangerous or resource-driven jobs, there's a part of them that's very aware that this industry isn't really there for the good of the world, right? And so they have, like I said, they're conflicted about that. They're probably scared. Their employer is very, very powerful, et cetera, et cetera. And so part of them, I think this was just a little narrative of part of them wanting to tell me that story, and part of them also fearing to tell me that story.
And you talked to the Fairbanks.
Yeah, I talked to Fairbanks.
Wow. So could you tell us a little bit about the Fairbanks and what the experience was of talking to them?
The Fairbanks are really lovely. Yeah. So they're a historical, John Henry Fairbank was a big wheel in the oil industry in the 1860s and was a politician, was a powerful, connected, one of the big sort of founding families of the area. And now, or at least when I was researching, Charlie Fairbank was running the Fairbank oil fields, which is right next door to the Oil Museum of Canada. And he welcomed me into his home, and I sat there and talked to him, and he gave me books. And he's a historian as well. He's written about the history. He's also fascinated and very driven by the history. And so he was a super open guy. And like I said,
was there reticence there as well, though? different kind,
I
perhaps?
didn't quite pick up on reticence. I think it's really important for the Fairbanks, and it seemed to me to be really important for Charlie Fairbank that this history be preserved and explored and looked at in a real open and honest way. And I think, one of the things he wants to do is preserve that history and sort of disseminate that history. And I think in that way, I really see eye to eye with him. I'm sure there's many ways that we're not alike as well. But yeah, I don't really see him as big oil.
Right.
If you know what I mean.
Yeah, and an independent family that's been generation to generation.
Very different story and a fascinating story.
The great Canadian historical novelist Guy Vanderhaeg has called the historical novel an awkward centaur. I love that phrase, an awkward centaur, because it is uniquely or ungainly species that is of literature that is neither completely one thing nor the other, neither completely history nor is it completely fiction. It's a hybrid creature between fiction and history, always minding that temporal gap. Oil People has a fascinating construction with two narrative timelines, 1862, 1987, which coalesce to offer a new way of apprehending the present age of oil. Could you talk about how you constructed the novel's apprehension of historical time in this way? Why did you decide to do these two parallel narratives?
I didn't really decide. I was forced to do these two historical narratives. I was writing, for a long time, I was writing it just as a historical novel. And I was just, I guess it's still just, if you consider 1987 historical, as I think you are here, and I think you're right too, it's still a historical novel. Right. But as I was originally writing it, it was maybe from the 1860s to maybe the 1870s, because I really wanted to get those nitroglycerin torpedoes in to the story.
Brilliant.
But yeah, so it was very much a 19th century story, and I just kept writing. I had like half a full-length manuscript, and I just was sort of getting tired of it.
Right.
And that's not a good sign, right? And it's also very normal to get tired of a novel halfway through writing a novel. So maybe it wasn't that bad of a sign. Maybe I should just gone with it. I don't know. But I was stuck, right? And so I didn't know what to do, and I was just sad. I was a sad dude. And then I got invited to write a short story for Maisonneuve magazine, and I wrote them.
Sorry, which magazine?
Maisonneuve.
Okay, so check this
out. It's called, believe it or not, Oil.
There we go. There we go.
And I wrote the story of Jade. It's a very different story, and it didn't end up quite making it like going directly into the book or anything. But I suddenly had this character of Jade who lived on an oil museum in the 1980s and could comprehend or apprehend or look back on and reflect on this history. And suddenly I could just see, holy cannoli, these two
Another
moments.
holy cannoli
Yeah,
moment.
yeah, another holy cannoli moment. Yeah, I love cannoli. Yeah. And I could just see the way these two moments would bounce off each other and the energy that would give me. And I could also see that it wasn't going to be enough for me to be able to put the awkward centaur on the page in the 1860s and have the reader today deduce. Yeah. I needed a character that could come along and look at the longer century plus 130-year history of oil and to articulate it and consider it and show it to the reader. Because I couldn't ask the reader. There was a story that I wanted to tell over that period of over a century. And the way those two bounced off each other was also really important. I don't know if you're going to ask me about time. There's a lot about time and temporality that also interests me here.
Before we do, why don't we give everybody a taste of the narratives?
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah?
Totally. I would just say one more thing on that question, though.
Yeah, definitely.
Is that...
Don't mean to rush along,
This contemporary... I don't think I quite realized this until I was writing the novel, but you indicated this. There's also the contemporary moment can't not be in the novel either, right?
Yeah.
So there's this, that is such a fun thing about writing a historical novel is that you're like, I'm showing you history, but you're reading it now.
Yeah.
Or like, you're always going to know I published this in 2024. Yeah. And so like, I think of like Hawthorne writing about the Puritans and how like, just those sort of, the weird temporality of how that works. And so for example, with something like climate crisis, that wasn't really on the tip of anyone's tongue in 1987, right? Even global warming was sort of like fringe science in 1987, wasn't really generally accepted or generally known. And so I'm well aware, here's what my contemporary audience knows, here's what Jade Armbruster doesn't know in 1987. And so there's also a certain temporal management there, right?
Yeah.
Which I found productive.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Let's hear how the bouncing at work.
Okay.
I like that phrase too, the bouncing back and forth.
Yeah. I'm going to read. Oh, shucks. Am I going to read? Yes, I'm going to read. Yes, I'm going to read a certain section that I had planned to read. I have a very special someone in the room here. I have many actually special someones in the room. So I love all of you. But one of them read this book in manuscript stage and gave me editorial feedback. And his name is Blair Trewartha.
Brilliant.
And he singled out this section, and he really liked this section. So I'm going to read this section.
Amazing.
It's from the 1987 Seam. And I think it speaks to some of the stuff I've been talking about as well. So this is sort of Jade Armbruster, our 13-year-old protagonist, narrating. Say what you want about oil, about toxicity and leaching and contamination, but here is where it gets complicated. You can build a home with oil. So all the love and wonder I knew was made there. In the 3 willow sisters that stooped over the creek in the North Woods, in the appliance graveyard and the forests of turkey's tail mushrooms, the cleared patch of aspen next to the long abandoned cellar of the old house, where Angie had stolen Dad's 22 one weekend, taught me how to aim it up and to the left, how to take a breath and hold it there, shattering a row of Diet Coke cans. Home was walking through the South Woods, looking for berries, chomping on blueberries and blackberries and wild strawberries, eating the green ones with a hint of red. And then some days you'd find a whole lush stash, all of them ripe all at once. And you'd sit picking and then gorging yourself diuretic, your hands stained sweet and red. Home was in the Blue Creek clay, where we dip our toes, watch the swallows come back year after year, wait for leeches and burn them off with pilfered matches. Home was starling murmurations over the fields, Dad salting slugs in the rhubarb, shooting his 22 at the rabbits that stalked the shard at the fringes of the vegetable patch. Home was walking into the South Woods in spring, to the frog pond, collecting tadpoles in old jam jars, water striders and lily pads, and the honey-washed light slanting through the green bilge in our jars, the tadpoles disappearing and reappearing, tiny green bodies like swimming leaves. Home was the Roma tomatoes. Mom would always can herself with a little bit of fresh basil so that she could pull it out in the middle of winter when the whole world was white. 6 feet of snow at the door, and Dad crawling out the window to shovel, and Mom would pull those cans up from the basement and make spaghetti, make tomato soup with a sprinkle of sour cream and tarragon and call it Taste of Summer. Home was Christmas cookies, sugar cookies shaped with aluminum cutters into flowers, hearts, circles, the thin white batter on my fingers, the 4 of us gathered around the pink kitchen, dancing together, Dad taking me high into his arms and changing the lyrics to Van Morrison, singing me into his blue-eyed girl. Home was numb feet. Home was numb feet in winter, skating up the creek, careless of pins and needles, shoveling up to the golf course and back, sometimes skating to school right through March, me and Angie holding hands and singing Cyndi Lauper, True Colors, watching the vivid redness of the hawthorn rising out from the white snow, a burn in our thighs and slather on our backs as we skated on the pocked and tumored ice. And then at the end of the day, cheap powdered hot chocolate, watching Alf and falling asleep on the couch, the jerker line swaying in the windows, and the rhythm of that, too, was home. So that's the section Blair liked from the 1987 seam.
A great section. You can feel David's lyrical, poetic prose that come through in that passage a lot as well.
So did you want me to go ahead and read?
I think it'd be kind of neat to hear an 1862 passage as well. So you can hear the two narratives that stitch together.
So usually that's what I like to do, is read a little bit from one and then a little bit from the other. So that's Jade's world, picture of Jade's world there. And now we're going to come back to Clyde. Have I talked about Clyde? Clyde is a little bit of a, you talked about sort of, he's obsessed with oil. He wants oil. He's drilling for oil. He's hungry for oil. He's a little bit lost. He's a little bit delirious. He he's a poetic thinker. He ends up inventing certain technologies. He is a terrible businessman. So this is him. He meets a neighbor named Arliss Mayweather, who's a little bit more of a mustache twirling villain. And this is the moment when he meets Arliss Mayweather. He arrived on Mayweather's fields, but there was no Mayweather. So he hitched the horse and turned towards the shanty on the edge of the property. There were just outbuildings and a half-built fence, a sea of stumps and a few hand-dug wells strewn with chopped roots. "Whoa there," called a wheezy, whistly voice from below. Clyde looked down and saw a man's face sticking out of the bottom of a 20-foot hand-dug well. "There's a dapper maiden yonder in a vulnerable state," said the man. And then the earth started to wriggle, and a yellow snake slithered out of the muck, revealed itself as a rope the man was yanking on, tied to the same post where Clyde had hitched the mare. "Dangerous stuff," the man said, rising naked and dripping as he headed to a square door frame in the middle of the field. The oil clung to his chest hair, globbed in his pelvis, where the slug of his cock hung shrunken, all skin. In spite of the oil all over him, he was clearly a blond man, a little gingerish. "You want to get rid of a body around here," he winked, thumbing down into the poorly dug well. "You know where to do it." He pulled on a rope to dump a bucket of cold water over himself, and then he began to scrub with a curry brush that had been resting beside it. "Crude bitumen," he grinned. "Nothing better for the skin." Clyde gauged his new neighbor, fully naked, tugging at the husk of his member. As the man scrubbed, Clyde watched the worming of his yellow mustache, the wince of his prominent brow, trailing into a long widow's peak. "Arliss Mayweather," the man announced, extending a handful of flat fingers. "Future mayor." Clyde laughed and introduced himself, stood watching as Mayweather finished his washing up, walked around the site with a showman's hitch in his stride. Another bucket and a few more rounds of the curry brush, and he stopped, though he wasn't close to clean. Mayweather rubbed his mustache, left streaks of black in the corn yellow fur. "You've been here a few years, I gather," he said. Clyde nodded, and Mayweather said, "Come on," led him down past the well, where he'd had his oil bath, and on to the next one, which was sunk to nearly 40 feet, rigged with drilling pipe and a spring pole. Mayweather jumped on the treadle, and the rig ground but made no progress. "There's a jam," he said. "I don't know what's caused it." Clyde clucked. "Where are your drillers?" "They're in short supply," Mayweather said. "They come and go." Around his ankles there was a pool of muskeg, laced with a dribble of raw crude. Clyde squatted, stuck his left hand in, and watched the black gore squelch through his fingers, gleam in the morning light. 1,000 shades of black, each darker and richer than the last. Clyde grabbed a crowbar and the line from the hitching post and headed down into the well, went in knee-deep and fished the bar around, found a rock that had gotten on the wrong side of the bit, beneath it a leather liquor flask. He came up panting, kicked the sludge off his boots, tossed the rock into the field, and threw the flask at Mayweather's feet. "Watch your men," he said. "Can't have all manner of junk tumbling in with the cuttings." Mayweather ran a hand through his thin yellow hair. Worry lines winced around his mouth. There's a lot of men out here, he said. Few you can trust. Clyde shrugged. The bits ground dull, he said. Mayweather stared at him. His eyes were bright. The skin around them fissured, black. The first 30 yards is all clay, Clyde said. The bit chews through it like butter. After that, you get into the shale, then it's bedrock. You've got to change the pipe every couple of pipe lengths. You've got to change the bit every couple of pipe lengths. He paused, watched a woman appear in the doorway of the simple log house. She wore a light brown frock, her legs bare. You'll want to use a 4.5-inch bit, Clyde managed to say. Mayweather scratched his chin, raised his head, and scented the air. Clyde had known men like him. Men who didn't like it pointed out when they were doing something wrong. A rare species. Mayweather told him to wait there, and Clyde thought about leaving. Watched a horse-drawn wagon come down the concession and get its wheel stuck. A stately Percheron braying and shivering. Mayweather came back with his wife, both of them carrying 2 barrels of water. She had taken the frock off and was now dressed, like her husband, in nothing but India rubber boots. Crude oil streaked here and there over pale breasts and brown nipples. The skin, she explained, beaming. It took all of him to keep looking into her face. This is Dorothy, Mayweather said. She nodded hello, pitched a bucket of water over Clyde's back, told him she'd recommend a scrub. Clyde wondered how long they'd go on with these buckets, these baths. It was the waste of water that irked him. Rainwater was $1 a barrel out here. Clyde shivered, the water cold on his soaked shirt. He shook the drops off and stared at this woman, her eyes changing from green to brown as she moved from shadow into light. Dorothy cracked into a smile, and Mayweather laughed a big roaring laugh, and Clyde saw that he had not one new friend, but 2. Dorothy rubbed her stomach then, and he allowed himself a glance. Saw the tender swell of it, oil muck smeared black over the crest, her skin the color of driftwood. A boy, she smiled, tracing a circle around her navel, the crude swirling into rune. How do you know? Clyde said. Dorothy spoke without looking up, spoke as much to herself as to him. I'm growing a beautiful baby boy. Thanks.
Brilliant. Wow. So I'm eventually very quickly going to turn to questions and comments, cogitations from you here, and anybody online, you can use the Q&A button or the chat, and we can pick it up as we go along. I've got a couple of questions, and I'm going to turn to you, but I just thought I'd signal to you that we're going to come to you in a second. So there's another idea of time that's at work in the novel, and we just heard it very much in the passage that you read, namely deep time, which you're cueing to, which forces us to think more deeply, to think about the underlands and their presence in our lives. In an essay, the Hazlitt essay, you write, and this is David's words, to study oil, you must become an amateur geologist. And one of the fundamental insights of geology is the revelation of the depth of matter and time. When you think hard about rock, deep time, and the Earth's core, you realize how shallow and impoverished it is to live on and think with the mere surface of this planet. And I wonder, how did you approach your thinking about underlands? How did that inform your writing? And I'm thinking in particular of how it informs your vantage point of being an oil spectator, to think with oil rather than for or against it.
Yeah. That's a good question. So in my thinking of underlands, I'm very inspired by Robert McFarlane, who wrote a book called Underlands. Really, really awesome book. Can't recommend it enough. He talks about, and I do cite him in that essay, he talks about horizontal versus vertical thinking, right? So I think one of the revelations that I had, I had been thinking about deep time for a while, just sort of reading about the Anthropocene, and I'd been learning about geology and finding that I was surprisingly interested in it. I had never been someone that was, to me, like any word with an ology at the end was always like a little shivery. So to find that I was actually just, there's a poetry in rock, right? And the more you think about it and the more you learn about it, it's just a fascinating sort of counter story to the very shallow story of human history. And it's just a nice epiphanic moment to go through, to be like, holy Batman, holy whatever Batman, what do you say?
A third cannoli.
Yeah, no, I'm not doing a third cannoli. No. To be profound, just to be in awe of how puny we are as human beings in the deep scale of time. I think that's a sort of revelation that many of us have had in this room, I'm sure at one point or another, that the Anthropocene compels us to sort of dwell in that, and that's a sort of beautiful thing about, that's one beautiful thing about being alive in the Anthropocene, is just that shift of scale to allow you to see the relative insignificance of human history.
Right.
So I'm always, that's just that sort of reflexive move back and forth between shallow time and deep time is a move that I'm often compelled to make, and a move that Jade, being an avatar of me, is often compelled to make in the novel, and a move that just comes naturally when thinking about and writing about oil, and that creates a disorientation as well, that I think I can use productively as a character disorientation in the novel, because it is a bit like nauseating and sickening also to suddenly, like, it's like looking into the void, right? And looking into a vast depth and experiencing vertigo, to suddenly realize, however many times it happens, it doesn't really get old for me, right? To again think about, like, I'm so worried about like what happens 5 minutes from now and what happened yesterday and what's going to happen tomorrow, and I'm planning super hectically, thinking about all these minute things that in the bigger space of time just are so inconsequential.
Yeah. And through Jade's narration, we also see thematic elements of the Gothic intersecting with her confrontation with the legacies of environmental contamination, both physically and psychically, as it's impacting her, to introduce a novel take on that Southwestern Ontario eco-gothic, which came in the book's description as well. In a previous conversation we had, you made a remark that has really stuck with me. This was a 2022 conversation. David said, "There's nothing more Gothic than oil." A really compelling and challenging idea. Jade's present life in 1987 is inextricably haunted, not only with her past ancestor Clyde, but also the deep time of oil that consumed him like a passion. That delirium that you described. I wonder, and you could hear it in the passage that you read, I wonder if you could talk about your approach to the eco-Gothic and how it works bounces back, to use your phrase, back between the two narratives.
Yeah, well, it's really interesting for me because, like, I do think there's a profound connection for me between oil and Hades, for example. Like, it's an underworld, it's really creepy. We're taking this ancient life that is stewed underground for hundreds of millions of years and bringing it back up, right? So there's a sort of a reverse burial, or a sort of that
uncanniness.
And so that's just one of the many ways in which oil is Gothic or uncanny to me, but at the same time, to me, oil is like distilled. One of the things that's weird about it is that it's like it contains so much energy, right? Like that's one of the things that's why it sort of disorients our experience of time as well, and our experience of place in sort of our ability to move super fast via oil. And that's something I've been thinking about recently, is just like that hyper concentration and sort of just the pressurization of that, and the idea, and that's part of the wonder as well, right? That but just like there's an insane amount of life compressed and distilled, an insane amount of biological matter, which therefore creates energy in this fluid, right? I think there's just something super wild and super weird about that for me. But also for me, interestingly enough, like just vegetation is sort of uncanny.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, and so I don't know if you could follow me all the way there, but like a plant is weird, right? Like, if you walk in the forest, and I think this is one of the things that like one of the things that one of the reasons why I don't know. I just think there's an intrinsic relationship between Gothic, which is actually about an excess or a challenge to human convention, right? And human orderliness. And the idea, it's also about death, right? Because death obviously is the big challenge to human containments and human forms of order, right? But if you walk in the forest, there's something like, we all know, that experience of like, you think there's an animal just around the corner, but it actually ends up being a rock. You know what I mean? When you're around the corner, that's the uncanny, right? And you also know that there's the shapes that you will see on the forest floor. Well, they do follow a certain kind of pattern. It won't ever be the pattern that you have in this room, right? And so there's something transgressive, I guess, for me about the forest and about plants in general that I think is sort of like hyper concentrated in oil in a way.
Yeah, that's amazing. One of the revelations that emerges in your book is to try to confront the reader with our collective embarrassment and shame of oil, which links us back to that reticence and maybe even to reimagine an aesthetics of petroleum, an aesthetics of oil. Maybe even the beauty of oil, which kind of takes us back to that student confronting your remarks about the beauty of oil. Could you tell us about the beauty and the aesthetics of oil? And how it relates to that embarrassment and shame too?
Interesting. Someone said my book cover is very gasoline, which I liked. I mean, you're all familiar with like bit of diesel in a puddle, right? Or a bit of gasoline spilled into a puddle in the way that it makes a rainbow. So I don't know, for me, that's just a sort of poetic encapsulation of the way that a beautiful moment can emerge from a toxic substance, right? I find that really interesting and curious to me. And I think these sort of moments of beauty are increasingly available to us, and that's unsettling, right? And that there's also just something weird about plastic, right? Something weird and strange and compelling about plastic as well, which I think embodies, because plastic's derived from petroleum, I think it very much also embodies just that slickness and that slipperiness and that gleamingness. I think it's very much a sort of realm of beauty that I grew up in. I think sort of much of like 1980s, 1990s science fiction was sort of just like a celebration or just an aesthetic contemplation of this sort of uncanny beauty. This is actually called hydrocarbon sheen, like the idea that the particular way that hydrocarbons sheen, sort of shimmer.
And everybody's
in
seen that in a puddle. You see the rainbow effect that happens to it, which, the oil drop and amazing. When you talk about the beauty of oil, when you're teaching, because David, of course, teaches writing, and in events like this, do you often get the reaction that student gave you of like, this is weird?
No, but I think that's the most honest. I think that's what I loved about that.
It was a very honest response that she gave you.
I think that's what I loved about it, was how honest she was. And I think many people have thought that, but they're just sort of sitting there looking at me, like being like, I don't quite get it, and they're not brave enough to be like, I don't vibe with this at all.
Well, that's a good segue to actually ask if people have comments or questions, or if anybody online has a comment or a question for David in terms of what we've been discussing. You can jump in. Yeah. Oh, one sec. because anyone online can't hear you, and I apologize to the online people, there's going to be a little crinkle as I take this off with the sound, but just so everybody can hear. Sure. One sec here.
I'll hold this.
Yeah.
Alrighty.
Just talking to it as if it's a mic.
I think it's hoily canoily.
Hoily canoily.
I think that's what Robin says to Batman. But anyway, thank you for the talk. It was wonderful and really intriguing. Something I heard you say a few times was this phrase, deep time.
Yeah.
What is deep time, or what is the sort of, what's to be gained from that phrase versus time? It's just unfamiliar to me.
Yeah, deep time is just a term from geology for just the full expanse of hundreds of millions of years since sort of the beginning of life to now. So this is sort of like the interesting thing about it is that this discovery is contained within geology, and that prior to the 19th century, they wouldn't have known, people didn't generally know that time went back as far as we now believe that it does, right? So that's the interesting thing about sort of Darwin and the discovery of the fossil record, is finding out holy shnikes, Batman, there is this ancient form of life, right? And it really opened the world, and that's deep time, and it challenges Judeo-Christian ideas of timelines as commonly thought, and it challenges the idea of human history, and it challenges the idea that history begins with man. So life, it's a modern scientific worldview in which most of us are well schooled, right? Yeah, but at the same time, still makes us a bit wary and uncomfortable when I think we really think about how tiny of a fraction human existence is within the whole picture, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Any other questions, comments for David? Yes. I'm going to make sure I avoid being in front here.
Thanks, David and Josh. That was great. That was really a wonderful conversation. So my question is kind of a what next question, but I noticed that you said something about a trilogy, and then you said, I don't think it's a trilogy. So I guess my question is, are you going to keep are you planning to keep working on oil? Are you going somewhere else? Where is all this work of oil kind of taking you? Because obviously whatever is next comes out of this in some way or another.
Yeah. I think I wouldn't say I'm done working with oil forever, but I think the next book will have very little to do with oil. I've stewed in oil a lot, and it's a heavy and beautiful thing to think with. But I think the book that I'm working on now, is that basically what you're asking about? Yeah, will most likely in its current form seem to be about a much more oceanic book. So the way that I sort of see it is, and I see those things as powerfully connected. I mean, yeah, oil is a kind of its own ocean underwater, and a lot of it comes from marine life as well. So there's clear connections. And I think of it sort of the next thing that I'm writing. In a weird way, the current thing, Oil People, was very much a sister book of my short story collection, Chemical Valley. And the next thing that I'm writing is much more a sister book of my first book, Peninsula Sinking. So it's much more about oceans and animals. And I guess it's also sort of about extinct animals and animals that are going extinct. So that's, part of the whole story too, right? So I'm just trying to say the ways in which there's continuity and also departure, if that makes sense. Yeah.
So you mentioned some of the workers you talked to were very cagey.
Yeah.
Reticent. I'm curious, what are some of the questions that they didn't like?
You know refiners, what they're like? Yeah. So you've experienced some of that reticence as well?
Pressure on them.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. They definitely get a lot of pressure, and they have anti-media. I made it very clear in that conversation that I'm not media, right? And that this was not going to be a published media thing. I'm writing fiction, and I was writing fiction about this, so it wasn't ever going to be no names were ever going to be named. No one was ever going to be identifiable. It was all very safe, and yet they were still concerned. The questions I was asking was just about their job, very basic level. It's hard to get in and actually see what a refinery looks like. And so I was writing a short story about a petrochemical refinery, and I wanted to get the veracity as best I could, right? And so I was just asking about everyday details of their job, what does it look like to operate various machines, and what do you wear, and tell me about those showers that you have to take after your shift, and where do you park, and stuff like that. Who's your boss? What's the structure? All those kinds of questions that you would naturally ask if you were trying to depict it in a short story. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yeah, this gentleman here, what were some of your thoughts as we were talking about in terms of your experience with the refinery? I'm kind of interested.
Would love to hear that. Yeah.
Well, I grew up in that whole area, so in Wyoming, Ontario. So there's a big connection between Wyoming, Petrolia, Sarnia.
Yeah.
What I remember the most is how much oil was spilled. I mean, it was 100 years later, whatever, but there, you could walk through fields and sink into oil up to your ankles. And it was, they had a refinery in Petrolia at one time before it moved to Sarnia. I imagine it moved because of the river. It was easier to ship the oil, but it was just, it was the pollution. You could dig down a foot, I bet you, and find oil all over. So the spillage was a big thing. And then I think I've read where when a geyser hit, it could last for days before they could cap it.
Yes.
So around oil springs, there's tons of oil too.
Yeah, which is a remarkable. I was going to ask these, but these are the kinds of questions that I want to leave to you because I don't want to spoil the narrative of the book. But the gusher, the first gusher, David really sits with it, and it's a really brilliant part of the book. But the real gusher, it lasted for how long? Like
about 3 days.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's pretty neatly mapped on in the book. The first gusher, which was Hugh Nixon Shaw, would days at a time would spill for. Yeah. So that's quite a sublime experience, right? To be witnessing. And it was crazy. And obviously the whole community was down there trying to deal with it, but not having much luck because they weren't expecting it, like especially that particular one.
Didn't know what to do.
Yeah, no. So eventually they stuffed a bunch of flax into the well so they could finally get the tight
like
pipe.
A calf wrapping. Like
Yeah. So they could eventually get a pipe down into it and wrap the head.
Because there's apparently somebody, this is me, I did reading to try and engage, and I learned all this stuff. But the thing that I was so fascinated by was the fact that there was a foreman there from Pennsylvania who had come from, because Pennsylvania also had a gusher. There's a real fight between oil springs and Petrolia over the firstness, because there's one Titusville in Pennsylvania that had a gusher just before, but didn't have the industrial oil well that was hand dug. But it's just the description that there was somebody there that they were moving back and forth. And a question too, that you could maybe tell us, because this is in the book a couple of times, the hard oilers, the oilers would go around the world after they'd had their experience in Ontario. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's a huge feature of the history that's not really part of my book, because it's sort of in that space in between 1862 and 1987. But especially towards the end of the 19th century, there was this thing called the Canada rig, or the Canadian rig. And that was like a development of the steam drilling technology, but they would take that over to like places like Java and Borneo, and they would just Galicia oil fields around the world, and they would export this technology and export their expertise. And part of that was also about the lack of oil. Like there is still oil there coming up out of the ground, but it's a paltry amount, because most of it was taken out of there. So there's all these people with expertise in this field, and they no longer had real reserves of oil. And so they would go over and export their knowledge and export their technology and just be good Canadian oil ambassadors.
Yeah. Any other comments, questions? I have one question that I'd maybe like to conclude us with, and David, I'm sure, has time afterwards if you wanted to come up and talk to him individually. Is there anybody online,
deep time,
Sam? That's okay. Yeah, deep time, deep time. We're hosting this event during a time of crisis and change, literally days from the American election. So if anyone watched this recording, we don't know the results of what's going to happen literally in a few days, which is going to have massive impact on the future direction of climate policy, amongst so many other things. Every day we receive fresh news of climate-related disasters, hurricanes, flooding, wildfires, melting glaciers, severe weather, disappearing lakes. So the fear and apocalypticism can be incapacitating. You strive in your writing not to be didactic, not to sermonize, and yet you also make the case for joy, for complexity, wonder, and curiosity. In the face of eco-anxiety, eco-despair, feelings of climate doom, I wonder if you could put I could put a quarter in here to get your thoughts, as unfairly capacious as this question is.
Yeah.
It's a concluder, on the place of fiction, poetry, storytelling to respond and confront the realities of climate change and its complexity for contemporary life. Is there a place for joy and hope while minding that risk of didacticism?
Yes, I think there's a place for joy and hope. Yeah, I think there has to be. I think a lot of like hope, can be an anesthetic as well. So we don't want hope that removes us from action, right? But we also want, I think just storytelling has always been a part of the human animal and who we are, and an important, a fundamental part of who we are. And even like you've just told a story now, right? And not that it's not real, it is, but you've chosen a particular way to narrate the events, right? And so I think continuing to pursue that in a sophisticated way and continuing to pursue that to the best of our ability and continuing to, tell stories is vital. And I also just don't want a world where everything is 100% efficient, right? So I think we need these kinds of explorations. It ties into human creativity as well. And I think we'll need a lot of human creativity and new ways of thinking, seeing, knowing, which also includes new ways of confronting our histories in order to adapt as the animals that we are to the conditions that we're now facing. So, yeah.
Brilliant. Well, thank you all of you for coming today here at TAP Center for Creativity. Thanks to the TAP people for welcoming us. Great questions. Thank you everybody who joined us online. I think Sam said that we had about 25 people joining us online from the Interland or whatever ether place that you're coming to us from. So thank you so much. Thank you, Jenny, for being here to sell the books. If you haven't got a copy, you should definitely get one, and David could sign it or make his mark, whatever you decide to do.
I bought a stamp. I created a stamp, but I have no ink pad. So I'll just be signing.
A little ironic.
Boring.
Yeah, an ironic one given. Yeah. Well, thank you very much. And thank you everybody online. Please join me in thanking David for today.
Thank you.